This is what a street activated by a mix of one and multi-story buildings feels like. And this is what a street looks like with zero-story buildings, with parking. So how much of our central business district actually is made up of parking? Well, let's take a look. I made this map that shows Asheville's central business district. The buildings are shown in blue and the parking lots are shown in red. And when you add up the total area of all the parking and buildings and get the proportion of it that's parking, it's 57%. Over half of the space in our downtown is literally empty parking lots. About a week ago, I made a video about how single-story buildings are illegal in downtown Asheville and why I don't think that rule makes any sense. But just look at all of the businesses that occupy single-story buildings downtown that would be illegal to build today.
Boomers, Level 256 Arcade, Asheville Brewing Company, Bears BBQ, Ben's Tune-Up, High Wire Brewing.
And it flopped. The people hated it, okay? The comments were negative, didn't get good viewership, and people came away misunderstanding what it was that I was trying to argue for. The problem is that I was pointing out one specific regulation and using it as an example without giving the broader context of the way that this policy affects development in downtown Asheville. What I was trying to argue is that all of these land use policies have a cost that leads to bad land use downtown, like this parking lot. In order to understand my argument about single-story buildings, you have to already understand the land use context of downtown Asheville and the rules that made it that way. Every policy that affects land use has a benefit and a cost. So if you're in a place that frequently gets dangerous earthquakes, in the building code, there's going to be stuff in there to make sure that new buildings are built in a way that is safe to withstand earthquakes. And that costs extra money. That's not free. You're passing up on some of the value of these buildings in order to construct them in a more expensive way to make them safe. And that's the cost, but it's worth it for the benefit, which is the safety. A ban on single-story buildings downtown is aimed at the benefit of downtown density. So, has this policy achieved the outcome that we're looking for? No, not at all. Here's the same map, but with all of the new construction since 1997 overlaid. These are all of the buildings that have been built in downtown since 97. 3 years before I was born. There's not exactly an amazing outcome to be super happy with our policy here, considering the fact that almost nothing gets built downtown. Also, here's the map, but with all of the one-story buildings highlighted. Just compare how much of downtown is single-story buildings and parking compared to the absolutely minuscule amount of new construction that has happened since 1997. And you might think nothing gets built downtown and all of this excessive parking is here because of mandatory parking minimums. But the thing is, we don't have mandatory parking minimums in our central business district, and as far as I can tell, we never have. Now, you can argue that a lack of infill development downtown isn't due to the ban on one-story buildings, that it could be something else. And you'd be right, because the ban on one-story buildings is just one piece of policy in a tapestry of hundreds of rules that make it incredibly difficult to build anything new downtown at all. Other examples of things that make it really difficult for people to build new stuff downtown include fenestration and design requirements, height zone setbacks, shadow impacts, landscaping and buffering standards, sidewalk standards, building cap standards, maximum dimension standards, floor plate standards, public view corridors, and any change at all to the exterior of any building in downtown requires the review of Asheville's Downtown Design Review Committee, which adds time and costs extra money for developers. And these are just some of the examples of the rules that we have in our central business district, not including all of the rules that apply citywide. For example, you can only build up to 49 units of housing anywhere in the city before it automatically triggers a conditional zoning review, which means that city council has to approve it and public comment has a say. In other words, this is where housing projects go to die at the hands of NIMBY public comment. So the problem is not our aim for density. The problem is the cumulative impact of all of our well-intentioned, well-meaning zoning rules that make it too hard to develop downtown. We should be really serious about infill development within city limits, because there's tons of negative consequences when that development leaks outside of the city boundaries. For example, parcels outside of city limits don't have taxable land value that we can make money from as a city. So every time we add residents and buildings outside of city limits, that is a missed opportunity for the city to get money to improve its core services. Land development outside of city limits also leads to the slow motion environmental catastrophe that is the growth of the suburbs. So much good, preservable land is given up when we have the space for it right here. Development outside of city limits is also inherently car dependent. And finally, we know that our housing affordability crisis within city limits is a result of a lack of supply. So if we want to solve that crisis, we need to add supply within city limits. Otherwise, the cheapest housing will be outside of the city and people will be displaced. So why do we lack supply? Why is it so hard to build something new in city limits? As hard as it might be to do, put yourself in the shoes of someone who is able to develop property into housing. You have two options. You can either buy a piece of land downtown and voluntarily subject yourself to all of the onerous review and requirements and zoning restrictions and regulations and put yourself through a much longer development process that costs you more money because of all of that review, and also get yelled at by your NIMBY neighbors. Or you can just buy a much cheaper piece of land that's a lot easier to develop much more quickly outside of city limits and circumvent all of that. And we expect people to voluntarily subject themselves to our city's review process for building things downtown. Of course, developers are going to build things outside of city limits. It's easier for them, it's better for their bottom line, and all of this is because of how our zoning code works. So should we really be completely banning one-story buildings in an effort to create density downtown, when our downtown is mostly empty space, mostly parking, and under the current rules, almost nothing gets built? I don't think so. A ban on single-story buildings isn't free. It doesn't automatically create density. It doesn't automatically add a second story to every building that would have been built one story downtown. It just filters out those one-story uses from being able to exist here. All it does is remove value that we could have from our downtown. And that's a cost. That is a real cost. That's a massive cost. In fact, it's a cost that literally lowers the density of our downtown environment. It's a cost that makes this place less dense, less walkable, and less valuable. I'm against this rule, not because I don't like density, but because I recognize this rule hasn't created density. All it has done is make downtown worse. The whole point of the original video that I made is that a lot of value can be found in single-story buildings downtown, that they have a use, that they're useful to us. You would think an outright ban is something that would be reserved for the very most extreme and necessary of cases, like a coal ash pit, or like a textile mill or something like that. But we have decided that single-story buildings are somehow such a threat to density downtown that we have a rule that literally has reduced the density, reduced the walkability, and reduced the value of downtown and created fewer opportunities for businesses to add value here. This is insanity. And we've implemented this ban on single-story buildings in a place where
57%
of the downtown is literally empty parking lots. Yes, any business that works in a one-story building can also work in a two-story building, but only if that two-story building exists. And what we're choosing between is not a one-story building and a two-story building. What we're choosing between is empty, desolate land used for parking or a useful building. With new downtown construction being such a rarity, I don't think this argument's at all unreasonable. Single-story buildings are actually an important part of a healthy downtown. Even in the densest places in the country, you will find single-story buildings. Even in Manhattan, you will find single-story buildings. And if you look in your city at the cool neighborhood that's getting redeveloped right now, I think you'll find that a lot of the new cultural institutions that are able to pop up and exist are in single-story buildings because they're really useful for things like that. I also want to point out that if there's demand for something other than a one-story building to exist, well, the market takes care of that for us. This is 45 Ashland Avenue. It used to be a single-story building right across from our central bus station, and now it's 39 units of housing with commercial at the bottom. The market did that for us. We don't need a rule that bans the existence of one-story buildings that might be useful throughout all of downtown at the cost of everything that could have existed if we allowed those one-story buildings to be built. So if you take one thing away from this video, it's that we need to remove barriers to infill, and we need to make it easier for people to build things downtown at all scales, across single to multi-story buildings. We need all of it. We should be lowering the barriers to building things in Central Business District, not raising them by adding new regulations that are ostensibly to help increase density. If it's lowering density, if it's reducing the vibrancy of our downtown, then it's a bad policy. And we have to be critical of all of those barriers, not just the ones like minimum parking requirements. We have to also look at ones that appear like they're going to do something good. Because this one isn't doing something good. It's just making our downtown worse. We don't need that. And no, the ban on one-story buildings is not the only piece of reform that we should be doing on our central business district land use rules. We should be reforming most of them. We should be getting rid of as many barriers to new housing and new development as we can. Thanks for watching.